What is the science of reading? What are leaders doing to accelerate reading achievement? We answer these questions and more in Science of Reading Leadership, Guiding Minds, Transforming Lives, powered by Just Right Reader.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Science of Reading Leadership Podcast. We have an incredible guest for you all today. It's someone that I have been a fan of for a very long time, and that is Natalie Wexler. Natalie Wexler is an education writer and author of The Knowledge Gap, The Hidden Cause of America's Broken Education System and How to Fix It. She is also the co-author with Judah C. Hochman of The Writing Revolution, a guide to advancing thinking through writing in all subjects and grades, and the host of Reading Comprehension Revisited, a 6-episode series for the Knowledge Matters podcast. Her articles and essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the American Scholar, and other publications. She has a free Substack newsletter called Minding the Gap and lives in Washington, D.C. Natalie, welcome to the podcast. We're so excited to have you.
Well, thanks so much, Christy. I'm really delighted to be here.
So Natalie, on our pod, every single time we have a guest, our first question is always really about how did you get into education and in your case, education research. I'm so interested to see how your journey led you here.
Well, yeah, I mean, I myself I'm not a researcher in the sense of an academic researcher, but I, write about academic research. And I got interested in education sort of as a journalist, really. I mean, I've done a number of things in my life, but one of them is journalism. And maybe 12 years ago or so now, 13 years ago, I started writing about education reform activity here in Washington, D.C., where I live, because there really is quite a bit of it, was quite a bit of it. And looking into it, I sort of stumbled across a problem that seemed to be much bigger than Washington, D.C., and that really had been written about, but not in a kind of journalistic, engaging way. And it's an issue that seemed to me to be incredibly important, as education in general is incredibly important. And that is, why there was this huge and stubborn gap in test scores, basically between kids at the upper and lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. And so that led me to writing really both books, co-authoring The Writing Revolution, and I've been busy ever since.
I bet, especially in recent years. Natalie, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more. When you say the knowledge gap at its core, at kind of a simple definition, I know you have an entire book, so it's hard to probably boil down the definition of the knowledge gap into a small tidbit. But is that really what it is, the gap between high socioeconomic and low socioeconomic, or is there more to that?
Well, there is more to it, but I think, we collect data mostly on like race and ethnicity, to some extent socioeconomic status. But I think what's really at issue here is level of parental education. Okay. And that correlates a lot with low socioeconomic status and with being a historically disadvantaged minority. But the reason parental level of education is important is that a lot of what goes into reading comprehension and learning in general is how much knowledge you've already got. I mean, the more relevant background knowledge you have about what you're trying to read and understand or what you're trying to learn, the easier it's going to be for you to take in new information related to that. And so kids from more highly educated families are better able to pick up that kind of knowledge and vocabulary at home, and that gives them an advantage. But the good news is that this is something that schools can really address pretty directly. We can do a much better job of building that kind of knowledge for all kids starting early. I mean, really, we need to start kindergarten, if not before, because kids from highly educated families get this advantage starting from birth. And the longer you wait to start building knowledge, the harder it gets to close that gap because it grows every year.
Tell us a little bit more about building knowledge and what that looks like in a K-5 classroom or K-8 or even K-12, right? So tell us a little bit more about what you mean by what does it look like to teach knowledge building?
Sure. So, it's going to look different depending on the grade level. And I think, the problem at higher grade levels is often there is content in the curriculum. There is knowledge to be gained, but kids don't have the background knowledge they need to access the curriculum at the level it expects. They don't have the knowledge that's assumed by that curriculum. So my book and a lot of what I'm what I talk about focuses more on the elementary years because that's where you get the biggest bang for your buck.
Right.
And that knowledge building process should start but early through reading aloud and discussion when
Okay.
kids are still learning to decode. It's not like we first teach them to read and then they read to learn, because part of reading to learn is going to require some background knowledge. So we can start building that through read alouds of complex texts, texts that are more complex than what kids could read on their own, should be engaging. And they ideally will be organized around a topic. So you read a series of texts, and they could be a mix of fiction, nonfiction, about a specific topic, let's say sea mammals. And that kids really enjoy that. They really love going more deeply into a topic. What we've been doing is skipping from topic to topic because we've been focused on trying to teach these reading comprehension skills like finding the main idea. And it doesn't really matter what you're reading as long as you're practicing the skill, but it really does matter what you're reading. And you can bring in those skills as appropriate to help kids understand what you're reading about. And then another thing that's really crucial is class discussion. Having kids use the vocabulary they've just heard, talk about the concepts that they've just heard. And what that does is it helps transfer that information to long-term memory. And then once they have that background knowledge in long-term memory, it will help them read and write about those topics that they have acquired knowledge about. We have lots of evidence that having knowledge of the topic really helps you with reading comprehension. And of course, with writing, it's hard to read about a topic you don't know anything about, but it is virtually impossible to write about it.
I love that you have such a focus on that vocabulary and comprehension and writing piece, because we know that those are really important pillars when, we've talked about the science of reading, for several years now, with legislation and district policy. And it seems to always focus on decoding. And so you're really advocating for those other skills too, is what it sounds like.
Absolutely. And I want to make it clear that it's not that science of reading advocates have reduced reading to phonics, although that sometimes it's like a game of telephone. The message seems to come through as it's all about phonics. But of course, there's a lot of scientific evidence relating to other aspects of reading, including comprehension. I will say that the spotlight being shined in such a narrow focus on problems with phonics instruction has led to the assumption that those are the only problems we have with reading instruction, and that everything else is aligned with what science tells us will work. But that's actually not the case. So I do think it's important to recognize that. And I think it actually will help allay some of the anxieties and some of the concerns about the science of reading. And people are sometimes getting the idea that what the science of reading means is you have to spend the entire 2-hour reading block on phonics, but that no expert advocates for that. No. And so I think if we emphasize the importance of building knowledge through engaging read alouds and discussion and teaching kids writing and all of that, and how it all needs to be connected, that I hope everybody will see, oh, okay, there's a bigger picture here. Phonics is a piece of it. It's an important piece of it, but there's a lot of other stuff that needs to be happening simultaneously.
Absolutely. So even in those younger grades, when students are learning to decode, they are learning letter sounds and those patterns. You're saying we still need to make sure that we have really rich text being read aloud, that we have a lot of opportunities for writing. Is that what I hear?
Yes. And I actually was just putting together a presentation about this. An administrator that I spoke to, who is in Indiana, said, one of the things that she found difficult when she was trying to introduce a knowledge building approach to her district was that teachers felt kids need books in hands. That's what she kept hearing. That's the only way they're going to learn to read, books in hands. But she pointed out to them, and eventually she said they understood that is really limiting them to reading things they can decode themselves. And there's no need to do that. And that once they started reading aloud these more complex texts and spending time on them, they saw that the discussions got much richer. Kids' vocabularies were expanding, that they were better able to think about things, and they had a lot to say. But you have to give them some grist for the mill in order to get those wheels of thought processes going.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Tell me more, because I know that writing is a big focus for you. I would love to know a little bit more about how writing relates to reading comprehension and learning in general. What have you found through your investigations and your own research.
Yeah, and I wish there was more research on writing. There's very little compared to how much we have on reading. But I have done some research of reading in cognitive science, the science of learning, and it's really applicable to, we should really start seeing the science of reading as a subset of the science of literacy, so including listening, speaking, and writing, and all of that as a subset of the science of learning. And so what cognitive science tells us is it's really important to have things stored in long-term memory, because working memory, and that's the aspect of our consciousness where we're taking in and trying to understand new information, is very limited in its capacity. And so if you already have relevant information stored in long-term memory, like let's say you're reading about baseball and you already know what a double play is.
Right.
You don't have to think about that. You don't have to go look it up, and you can just attend to the new information in whatever the text is. And what writing helps with is, first of all, transferring new information to long-term memory. And because one thing that really helps with that is to talk about it in your own words, or explain it in your own words. And you can do that orally, but you can also do it in writing. And then we also need to be able to retrieve that information from long-term memory when we need it. And the way to enable kids or anybody to do that is to practice retrieving. The more you practice retrieving an item of information, the more likely you are to be able to get it when you need it. And again, a really great way to engage in that retrieval practice is explaining the information to someone else in your own words. And again, that's what we do when we write. So I think that is the secret of its power. But I will say we have many studies showing that when kids write about what they are learning, it boosts their learning, it boosts their understanding and their retention of that information. There's an important caveat, though, which is that writing is very hard. It is probably the hardest thing we ask kids to do. So if you just ask, fourth graders to write everything they can remember from what they've just read or just heard, that's not going to work very well, because they're juggling all sorts of things in working memory to try to do the writing. And so their working memory becomes overwhelmed and they don't get those knowledge building benefits of writing. So what we need to do is break down the writing process into manageable chunks and explicitly teach them.
This episode is brought to you by Just Right Reader. At Just Right Reader, we make decodable books in English and Spanish that are great for kids, schools, and families. Our decodables tell authentic stories of student lives, follow a rigorous phonics progression, and include a short video phonics lesson that reinforces learning at home and in school. To learn more about accelerating reading achievement with decodables, visit justrightreader.com.
I wanted to ask you about that because I did read, I can't remember if it was in the book or maybe in another article that I read as I was preparing for our interview today. I think I heard you say that it's really important to focus on the sentence level when maybe something larger is unapproachable for a student. Tell me more about that.
Yes, absolutely. So this is partly to modulate that heavy cognitive load, that burden on working memory. If writing is hard, writing at length just makes it harder. So having kids, having instruction start at the sentence level is going to open up more capacity in working memory for them to, think about information, but also to learn to write well. But the other reasons to start at the sentence level are that, if you've never learned to write a good sentence and you don't necessarily just pick that up from reading, you're probably not going to be able to write a good paragraph or a good essay. And then the third reason is that it has been found from studies that teaching grammar, writing conventions in the abstract does not work for most students. But that doesn't mean they don't need to be taught that explicitly. They do. But what works is to teach it in the context of their own writing. And again, that's where starting at the sentence level really makes it much more manageable than if you've got 5 pages of error-filled prose. Plus, one additional important thing is another barrier to reading comprehension, in addition to lack of background knowledge, lack of general academic vocabulary, is lack of familiarity with complex sentence structure, syntax, because writing always uses more complex syntax than spoken language, virtually always. And if you teach kids how to use that kind of syntax in their own writing, they're going to be in a much better position to understand it in their reading.
Love that. Love that. I want to switch gears just for a minute and ask you a little bit more about what you feel is the role of parents and family members in helping to close this knowledge gap. Have you seen anything or worked with any school districts or schools that are doing things that have been really positive in working with families to close the knowledge gap for students?
Yeah, I've certainly heard about some of them and seen some of those things. I think one important thing is just to tell parents about the curriculum, what topics are being covered, so that kids don't always volunteer, so sometimes they're more likely to do it, from what I've heard, if you are using a content-rich curriculum, because they get very excited about learning about the human digestive system or whatever, and will come home and tell you all about it. But, I think it is helpful if that doesn't happen for parents to know, and they could say, oh, so tell me about the human digestive system or whatever. I understand you're learning about that in school. I think that's really important. Of course, reading aloud to kids at home is also important. But I think in addition, it's important for parents to understand that having those back and forth dialogues with kids, extended dialogues, is really what's going to help build their vocabulary and their knowledge, the kind of academic vocabulary and knowledge that they are going to need for success in school. And maybe even asking them to try doing a little writing at home, although I think that's probably best done through the teacher and through the school.
So, Natalie, when I hear you talking about kind of content-rich classrooms and instruction, it makes me think of almost thematic units in a way. And I know that at least in the districts that I've taught in, those have been very popular and promoted in early childhood classrooms. But it seems to be that we've kind of moved away from that as students get into kindergarten and beyond. Would you say that we're kind of going back that route when we think about content knowledge, or are they totally different and I'm misunderstanding?
They're similar. There are some differences. And I think one is, when you say theme, it could be a meaty, content-rich theme, or it could be something that leads to very superficial treatment, like friendship around the world or something. And the problem with that is, it might not be that interesting because it's superficial, but also kids need to hear the same vocabulary and concepts repeatedly and in somewhat different contexts for those things to really stick and for them to understand the nuances of the words. And so sticking with a topic rather than a broad theme is more likely to do that. And then the other difference I would say is that my understanding is that often, teachers or groups of teachers would create the themes themselves and come up with the materials themselves. And that can work, but it's a lot of work. And teachers are not necessarily trained in curriculum design. So I'd say another major difference is that, what I would advocate for is a content-rich curriculum that has done a lot of that work for teachers and enables them to focus on how best to deliver that content to their particular students.
I love that you say that, because districts across the country have utilized teachers a lot in creating their curriculums. And, I've been one of those teachers who've been on those curriculum committees, and we're really not trained unless you have an advanced degree in, curriculum creation and some things like that. But I love that you say that, to really allow teachers to focus on the instruction as opposed to finding all of the resources and gathering all of those, because it takes so much time. When you think about your research and your observations, Natalie, what predictions or hopes do you have for the future of elementary education in the United States?
Well, I think I'm cautiously optimistic. I never expected that almost 5 years after the book came out, I would still be getting lots of requests to be on podcasts like this and to give presentations around the country. So there's a lot of interest in this idea of building knowledge and using knowledge building curricula in elementary school and writing as well. So that's on the positive side. I'd say, it's hard. There's so many competing pressures on schools, and I think there's this tendency to sort of do too many new initiatives at once that can conflict with each other. So that could happen. And I do feel that this idea that the science of reading means we just have to like fix the phonics part and then everything else can stay in place and all will be well. I think that is kind of a dangerous, we're in a risky moment, because if people try that and then it doesn't work, I mean, what could well happen is kids get to higher grade levels able to decode complex text but not able to understand it. And then people may say, well, you see, phonics doesn't work. Well, it doesn't mean phonics doesn't work, but it does mean it's not enough. But I worry a bit that people at that point could turn away from the science of reading in general and including phonics, which would really put us back in a really bad position.
I think that makes a lot of sense, that because of the way sometimes, not always, that the science of reading has been presented was always this idea of we weren't doing phonics. And we weren't doing phonics right. And so now that we focus on that, our vocabulary, fluency, comprehension instruction was all just fine. And that's not necessarily the case either.
That's absolutely, yeah, that is true. And I think, one of the formulations that has kind of led to that is that 5 pillars of early literacy, which, there's phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And it's cited by both sides, balanced literacy, science of reading, they both point to that. That is risky because it puts comprehension there as though it's the same kind of thing as phonics and phonemic awareness. But it also, gives people the idea that if they just keep doing the comprehension skills and strategy instruction, that's enough. Teachers think they are teaching comprehension, right? So why should they change anything? And I think what needs to be emphasized is, yes, there is evidence that teaching comprehension strategies, certain comprehension strategies, can boost comprehension, but it's not all you need to do.
So this leads perfectly into my next and last question, which is really about district leadership and all of the knowledge that you have about this topic. What if you had to give district leaders 2 pieces of advice to help them accelerate reading achievement in their schools? Really actionable steps, because we all know that there's a lot of great theory and a lot of great research out there, but if they could do 2 actionable steps, what would you say are those top 2 things that you would have them do?
Well, 2 things. Yeah. Well, I do think that it is crucial to adopt. It's not the only thing you need to do, but adopting a content-rich, knowledge-building elementary literacy curriculum is like a sine qua non. I mean, it is necessary but not sufficient, and you have to be careful in choosing. I mean, I would say do not just rely on Ed Reports. Ed Reports has some. Some of their all greens are fine. Some of them, you really have to look under the hood. And I would recommend going to the Knowledge Matters website for better guidance on which curricula truly are knowledge building. And then I think it's important to be aware that is just the first step, that teachers also need professional learning that is grounded in that curriculum. If you could have a really great curriculum, but if teachers don't understand, first of all, why they're being asked to use it and also how best to use it, it may not work. So you have to also invest in that professional support.
Thank you. I know that we will have a lot of district leaders across the country who glean so much from this episode with you. Natalie, we know that you've got a couple books. We'll definitely make sure that we link those in the show notes. But if our listeners want to hear more from you, where can they find you? Website, social media?
Yeah, my website is nataliewexler.com. Easy to remember. My Twitter handle is @natwexler. I'm on LinkedIn as well. So yeah, I think I'm pretty easy to find.
Okay, sounds great. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. It was truly an honor to spend time with someone, like I said, I've admired your work for a long time. So thank you again. And until next time, that's the Science of Reading Leadership Podcast.
Thanks for joining us. If you found this conversation valuable, please subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. We will see you next time on Science of Reading Leadership, guiding minds, transforming lives.